Hello, family. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also, share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The room was silent except for the haunting sound of Angela's stifled sobs. The once luxurious private ward now felt like a cold prison as she sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in her silk hospital robe, trembling. The doctor had just delivered the crushing news. Her baby girl had been stillborn. Her face was pale, her fingers digging into the bedsheets as the reality sank in. All she had wanted was to hold her baby and secure her husband Thomas's distant affection. She couldn't bear the idea of returning to that mansion with empty arms and even emptier eyes. "Please, don't let this be the end," she whispered, voice shaking. Dr. Kelvin stood rigid near the door, looking away. Then came her desperate plea. "There's another woman, a cleaner. She gave birth the same hour. She's poor, alone. Take hers. Give me that child." Dr. Kelvin froze. His Hippocratic oath collided with fear, fear of losing his job, fear of the Wellingtons' power. Angela's eyes pleaded, but beneath them was a veiled threat. After minutes of agonizing silence, he nodded. "If I do this, it never happened," he said sharply. Minutes later, Angela held a warm, breathing baby girl, her arms trembling, her tears now a confusing mix of grief and victory. As she exited the maternity ward with the swaddled infant, she passed Abigail's room. For a fleeting second, Abigail's half-open eyes caught sight of the woman leaving, and the unmistakable red mark beneath the baby's ear. Her heart skipped. Her baby was the only one born with that mark. Angela didn't look back, but Abigail never forgot that moment. Not that day, not 20 years later. Abigail lay on her stiff hospital bed, the sheets damp with tears she hadn't wiped since the nurse whispered, "I'm sorry. Your baby didn't make it." Her body was aching, but nothing compared to the gaping wound left in her heart. They hadn't even let her see the child, only showed her a lifeless bundle from afar. But something wasn't right. The nurse had avoided eye contact. The room had smelled too strongly of antiseptic, like something had been cleaned up too thoroughly. Abigail had felt her baby's kicks only an hour before labor, strong, urgent. Now suddenly, silence. She pressed her hand to her chest and murmured, "God, this pain. It doesn't feel true." When she returned home, she couldn't bring herself to enter the nursery she'd prepared with second-hand toys and freshly washed clothes. Her neighbor's baby's cries outside made her weep until morning. 2 weeks later, Abigail resumed work at the Wellington mansion because hunger did not pause for grief. As she entered the grand foyer, the smell of imported lavender hit her, followed by the soft cry of a newborn. She looked up and nearly collapsed. There in Angela's arms was a baby with the same fuzzy hair texture, the same delicate nose, and Abigail's heart seized the birthmark. A faint red mark beneath the ear, shaped like a faded raindrop. Abigail clenched the tray in her hands so hard her knuckles whitened. "How strange," she said to herself, unable to speak louder. "That looks exactly like." Her thoughts trailed off as Angela passed her without a word, the baby cooing softly. From that day forward, Abigail watched silently. She didn't accuse, didn't confront. But every bone in her body screamed what no one else could hear. And though she was forced to bow, clean floors, and wash sheets in the house that held her stolen child, her heart never let go of what she knew to be true. She whispered to the wind each night, "I see you, my daughter. I see you." Years passed like brittle leaves swept under expensive rugs. Abigail remained in the shadows of the Wellington mansion, enduring insult after insult as she cleaned the same floors her daughter crawled upon. She never dared speak of what she suspected. Who would believe a cleaner accusing a wealthy woman of baby theft? But her eyes missed nothing. Each time little Faith cried, Abigail's soul responded like a flame meeting air. She memorized every stage, her first steps, her first laugh, the way she hummed to herself when falling asleep. But she also saw what the world didn't. Faith's restlessness, her quiet tears at the top of the stairs after yet another cold remark from Angela. "She's a child made of light," Abigail once whispered to herself, wiping a window pane. "But she's growing in the dark." So she started collecting things, small, silent pieces of truth. It began with the crumpled note she found behind the guest room mirror, scribbled in Dr. Kelvin's handwriting. Final records destroyed as requested. She saved it. Then came the night she stayed late and overheard a hushed argument behind Angela's study door. Through a thin crack, she caught the words "switch, grave mistake," and "you promised no one would know." She recorded a snippet on her old Nokia, shaky hands barely steadying it. After that, a spare pair of gloves stained with dried blood, left forgotten under a bathroom sink, hospital grade, labeled with the date of Faith's birth. Everything went into a small wooden box hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her one-room quarters. It was the only power she had, truth stored in silence. And every time Angela walked by, commanding her with cold eyes and clipped tones, Abigail bowed her head outwardly, but whispered inwardly, "I haven't forgotten, and one day neither will she." Faith blossomed into a graceful young woman, adored by society for her poise, her elegance, and her golden upbringing. But under the glossy exterior was a quiet ache she couldn't name. She hated her own reflection for feeling unfamiliar, for looking into eyes that mirrored someone she didn't know. At social events, she smiled politely, but in private, her fingers trembled, her breath often short. "It's like I'm living someone else's life," she once confessed to her reflection in the mirror. Though she couldn't explain it, she felt strangely drawn to Abigail, the quiet cleaner who always seemed to appear when she needed help. When Faith suffered a sudden allergic reaction to a dessert during a luncheon, it was Abigail who rushed in with the right medicine, her voice calm but firm. "It's the peanuts in the cream," Abigail said gently. "You used to break out from it even as a toddler." Faith stared at her, chest still heaving. "How would you know that?" she asked. Abigail hesitated, then smiled tightly. "Mothers, I mean people who care, notice things." That night, Faith couldn't sleep. Something inside her stirred restlessly. She remembered the warmth of Abigail's hands, the way she'd whispered reassurances like lullabies. Angela had never done that, not once. Her mother was polished and powerful, but distant. The affection felt mechanical, rehearsed. Meanwhile, the housemaid, the woman who mopped her floor and ironed her school uniforms, always seemed to know what she needed before she spoke. One evening, Faith lingered near the servant quarters and saw Abigail seated under the moonlight, humming a soft tune. It was the same lullaby that had once calmed her night terrors as a child. Something inside her cracked. "Why do I feel safest with someone I'm not supposed to notice?" she wondered aloud. And far from where Faith could hear, Abigail wiped a tear and whispered back to the wind, "Because some bonds don't need names. They just are." The days bled into years, and for Abigail, suffering became her silent ritual. Her grief no longer came in loud wails, but in the way she folded laundry with trembling hands, or in how she stared at the family portraits hung across the mansion's polished walls. Her body aged faster than her years, her eyes dulled from constant emotional bruises. Angela had long established her place in the household, not just as the madam of the mansion, but as the enforcer of cruelty. "That's not how I want the towels folded, Abigail." "Must I always correct you?" she snapped one morning, flinging the perfectly folded linen across the room. Abigail simply picked it up without a word, her knees aching as she bent. "You forget your place far too often," Angela continued, voice sharp. Abigail didn't respond, not because she agreed, but because every word she held back was part of a vow she made long ago. Stay close to your daughter, no matter the cost. The other staff had long stopped speaking kindly to her. They mocked her quietly, saying she hummed lullabies to ghosts. "That one's a bit touched in the head," one of the younger maids said once, laughing behind her. Abigail didn't correct them. Instead, she retreated to her small room behind the kitchen each night, took out her box of secret memories, and whispered prayers to a God who hadn't yet spoken. Her most treasured ritual was sitting on her wooden chair at midnight, clutching the worn photograph of her baby taken right after birth, the only proof that once a real life had filled her arms. "You're so close, baby," she'd whisper through cracked lips. "I can't touch you, but I breathe the same air you do." Outside her door, Faith would sometimes pause unknowingly, drawn by the voice she didn't recognize, yet somehow longed for. And inside, Abigail hummed through her pain, strengthening her resolve not through anger, but through a quiet, unshakable love forged in the fire of loss. Angela believed that perfection was not born but sculpted. Faith was her masterpiece, shaped by etiquette coaches, image consultants, and weekly behavior audits. Her days were dictated by schedules and appearances. Chin up, shoulders back, confidence speaks before your lips do, Angela would instruct before every gala. Faith followed the choreography of a perfect heiress, each step rehearsed, every smile practiced. Yet with each curated event came a deeper longing to break free. She would stare out of the limousine windows at street vendors and families playing by roadside grills, wondering how it felt to live without scrutiny. Angela's compliments always came with undertones of command. You looked beautiful tonight, but you should have worn the sapphire earrings. Rubies are far too loud. Faith's responses became robotic. Yes, mother, I'll remember. But inside, a quiet scream pressed harder against her ribs each day. Abigail watched from a distance, heart silently breaking. She recognized the cracks forming in Faith's spirit, the same cracks Angela failed to see. One evening, while picking up Faith's evening gown from the dry cleaner's package, Abigail lingered longer than usual. Faith noticed and asked softly, "Is something wrong with the dress?" Abigail shook her head but couldn't help adding, "You wore it well, but you didn't seem happy." Faith blinked, caught off guard. No one ever noticed her feelings, only her presentation. I just don't know what happy looks like," she admitted, her voice a whisper. Abigail didn't respond immediately. She only looked at her with such tenderness that Faith felt warmth rise in her chest. "You will," Abigail finally said. "One day you will remember who you were before the world told you who to be." That night, as Faith lay in bed, she didn't replay Angela's instructions or Chris's forced compliments, only those few, gentle words from a woman she wasn't supposed to notice but couldn't stop thinking about. Faith hated hospitals, but her yearly checkup was unavoidable. The walls were too white, the smell too sterile, and the air too thick with memories she couldn't name. She sat on the edge of the examination bed, arms folded, as a nurse from the lab came in with her chart. The nurse stopped abruptly, squinting at Faith like she'd seen a ghost. You look like someone," she murmured, eyes wide. Faith raised a brow. "Someone from your family?" she asked casually. But the nurse shook her head slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "No, from here, 20 years ago. There was a woman, poor, sweet girl. Her baby had that same mark behind the ear." Faith touched the spot absently. "It's just a birthmark," she muttered, but her stomach tightened. The nurse quickly excused herself, leaving the chart behind and forgetting to close the door properly. Back at the mansion, Faith recounted the odd exchange to Abigail while they crossed paths in the hallway. One of the nurses acted really strange. Said I looked like some woman from the past. Something about a birthmark. Abigail froze mid-step. For a moment, time seemed to halt. "What did she say exactly?" Abigail asked, voice trembling. Faith tilted her head, puzzled. "She said there was a woman with a baby born the same day I was." She remembered the birthmark. Silence fell between them. Faith searched Abigail's face for a reaction, but Abigail quickly composed herself. "Hospitals see thousands of faces, dear. It's probably nothing," she said, turning away before Faith could question further. But that night, Abigail didn't sleep. She sat with the nurse's note pressed to her chest, her breath shaky. "They're remembering," she thought. "The world is starting to remember." And across the hallway, Faith stared at her own reflection, rubbing the birthmark behind her ear as if trying to rub away a truth she wasn't ready to know. Angela sat at the head of the dining table, her fingers tapping a steady rhythm against her wine glass as Thomas outlined the merger proposal. "Chris will stabilize the board's loyalty once he's engaged to Faith," Thomas stated without emotion, like she was a piece in a game. Angela nodded in agreement, her face unreadable. Faith, seated between them, blinked in disbelief. "You're deciding who I'll marry?" she asked, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Thomas didn't flinch. "You were raised for this. Chris is the son of our longest-standing ally. It's a logical union," Angela added. "He's a good-looking boy, charming, respectable. You'll grow to love him." Faith swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "And what if I don't?" she asked, eyes glistening. "Then pretend," Angela replied coldly, like every powerful woman does. Later that evening, Faith found herself sitting on the back staircase, her heels tossed aside, her palms damp. Abigail appeared quietly with a cup of warm tea, setting it beside her. "I thought you might need something to hold," she said softly. Faith picked up the cup, the heat grounding her. "They've arranged my whole life like a schedule," she murmured. "Now they want to script my future, too." Abigail sat beside her, a safe silence forming between them. "You deserve to choose," she said carefully. Faith turned to her, eyes pleading. "Do you think I'm weak for not fighting back?" Abigail looked her in the eyes and replied, "No. I think you're trying to survive a world that never asked what you wanted." For a long time, neither spoke again, but a quiet bond deepened, one that would soon become unbreakable. The ballroom was adorned with ivory flowers, golden drapery, and guests buzzing about Faith and Chris's upcoming engagement. Yet Faith stood frozen beneath the chandelier, her smile cracking like porcelain. Every toast sounded like a warning. Chris held her hand loosely, whispering into her ear, "You're lucky. Most women would die for this." She looked at him, lips tightening. "Then maybe one of them should be standing here instead." His smile faltered, but he said nothing. Angela, across the room, watched closely. Every second Faith hesitated, every shift in her posture was noted. "She mustn't embarrass us," she whispered to Thomas. "She'll obey." But they didn't know the storm building inside her chest, nor the memories flooding back, of nights crying in rooms filled with silence, of dreams that didn't fit the life they mapped out for her. When the music swelled and the crowd turned to watch her first dance with Chris, Faith's knees buckled. Gasps erupted as she collapsed, her body hitting the floor with a dull thud. Chaos followed, guests scrambling, Angela screaming, and Thomas yelling for someone to call the doctor. But in that haze of sound and light, Faith's unconscious lips trembled with words that silenced Abigail, who knelt beside her. "Mama, not you. Why did you leave me?" Abigail's heart dropped. She placed a hand gently on Faith's forehead, blinking back tears. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've always been here." Angela froze on the sidelines, her eyes wide with shock. And though Faith didn't wake until hours later, something unspoken had already shifted, the kind of shift that couldn't be undone. Abigail sat on her narrow bed, the distant sound of a siren fading in the night. Her hands trembled as she opened the hidden box beneath the loosened floorboard. The voice recorder lay there, covered in dust, but still intact, alongside the nurse's scribbled note and the faded baby photo with the red mark behind the ear. The photo was smudged, but her memory was clear. Her baby's scent, her baby's weight, her baby's soul, none of it had died that day. She took a pen and began to write. Her words were slow, deliberate, written with a mother's sorrow and restraint. "To my daughter," it began. "You were taken from me, but I never stopped watching. I never stopped loving. They called me mad, but I remember the sound of your cry. One day, I pray you'll find this, and maybe then you'll find me too." She folded the letter and added it to the box, sealing it with a trembling breath. Then she looked up at the cracked ceiling and let her tears fall freely. "Lord," she whispered, "I've waited so long. I don't want revenge. I just want her to know who she truly is." She rose slowly, joints aching, and placed the box back into hiding. The floorboard creaked as she pressed it shut. That night, she didn't hum her lullaby. Instead, she sat in silence, hands clasped, praying for timing to favor the truth. Upstairs, Faith stared out her window, touching the mark behind her ear again. Her chest felt heavy, her mind spiraling. A question lingered, loud in its silence. What if everything I know is wrong? As both women drifted into restless sleep in two separate worlds within the same house, destiny began its slow, inevitable march toward exposure. The afternoon was unusually quiet when Abigail heard the soft knock at her door. She paused, hands still damp from washing linens, and opened it cautiously. Standing there was an older woman in a faded wrapper, holding a worn handbag to her chest. "Abigail," she said, her voice tentative. "Do you remember me?" Abigail's eyes widened. "Mrs. Dupe?" The retired midwife nodded, tears already gathering in her eyes. "I've carried something for 20 years, she began, stepping inside, her hands trembling as she sat. "I was there that night. The switch. I didn't assist, but I saw enough to know what Angela did. They made me sign a paper. threatened my children. I've lived in fear, but I couldn't die with this on my chest. Abigail lowered herself slowly onto the chair opposite her, heart pounding. So it was true, she whispered, voice hollow. All these years I wasn't just imagining it. Mrs. Dupe reached into her bag and pulled out a folded page, an old delivery log from that night with 2 sets of birth times marked just minutes apart. Her fingers pointed shakily. This was yours. That baby with the birthmark? You weren't wrong, Abigail. That child was never Angela's. Abigail clutched the paper with both hands, her eyes burning. I kept her so close, scrubbed her floors, folded her clothes. She never knew. Her voice broke, and she leaned forward, burying her face in her palms. Mrs. Dupe rested a hand on her shoulder. You didn't fight back then, but you were never weak. You stayed for her. Abigail looked up, the fire returning to her eyes, slow but steady. I need her to know, not to hate Angela, not to punish anyone, but to know that she was never abandoned. The old midwife nodded, knowing this visit was only the beginning. The rain poured relentlessly that night, tapping against the windows like questions Faith couldn't shake. Something about the nurse's words still clawed at her, refusing to let go. She wandered the halls of the mansion like a ghost until her feet led her near the servants' wing, a part of the house she rarely entered. With the house asleep, she tiptoed to Abigail's door and knocked. There was no answer. Slowly, she pushed it open. The room was modest, a wooden bed, faded curtains, a single photo on the nightstand. Her eyes settled on the framed picture, an infant with a faint red birthmark behind the ear. Her heart stopped. She staggered closer, lifting it gently. Why does she look like me? She whispered, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced around, spotting a half-folded piece of cloth near the bed. It had the initials FD stitched in faded thread. Abigail entered moments later, startled to see Faith holding the photo. I was just, Faith stammered. Abigail's expression changed, not anger, but a sadness too deep for words. Who is this baby? Faith asked, her voice strained. Abigail hesitated, then walked to the table and sat. She's someone I lost a long time ago, she said softly. Someone who should have grown up holding my hand. Faith's brow furrowed. She looks exactly like me. Abigail didn't respond. Tears filled her eyes as she turned away. Sometimes life puts a wall between 2 hearts that were never meant to be apart, she murmured. Faith placed the photo down, her hands trembling. Abigail, are you trying to tell me something? Abigail only replied, the truth has a voice, Faith. It will reach you when you're ready to hear it. And though no confession was made, something shifted in Faith's soul that night, a silence that screamed louder than words. Angela paced her bedroom like a caged lioness. She had found the letter, Abigail's letter, hidden beneath a tray in the laundry room. Her hands shook as she read it, every word carved from the blade of betrayal. Her face contorted with rage as she stormed toward the servants' quarters. Bursting into Abigail's room, she waved the letter in the air. How dare you, she hissed, voice low and venomous. How dare you threaten what I built? Abigail stood still, unafraid, even as Angela closed the distance. You built it on a grave, she replied, her voice calm but fierce. On my child's grave. Angela slapped her hard across the face. The sound echoed, sharp and cruel. But Abigail didn't flinch. You stole her, she said, her voice trembling with restrained agony. You held her while I wept for a baby you knew wasn't dead. Faith had returned home early from a friend's house, pausing outside the hallway as she heard the confrontation, the sharp slap, the haunting silence that followed. She peeked through the crack of the slightly open door and saw Abigail's red cheek and Angela's fury. Her stomach churned. What is going on? She asked, stepping inside. Both women turned. Angela paled. It's nothing, she said too quickly. She's just overstepping. Faith glanced between them, her intuition flaring. Abigail doesn't raise her voice. What did you do to her? She demanded. Angela stammered. Abigail, still recovering, looked Faith in the eyes. One day, my darling, you'll find out what was taken from both of us. She walked out, leaving Faith standing between 2 women, one who had raised her in lies, and another who was beginning to speak with a truth that pierced straight through the silence. And in that moment, something inside Faith began to unravel. The morning after the confrontation, Abigail sat alone in her room, her hands resting over the wooden box hidden beneath the floor. Her heart felt like it was splitting open, not from fear, but from release. For 20 years, she had carried the weight of silence. Now, the time had come to let truth speak for itself. She retrieved the voice recording, the one she had secretly captured years ago of Angela and Dr. Kelvin whispering in the study. Though the tape had aged, the confession remained clear. She'll never know. The cleaner's child is better off with me. Abigail placed the recorder in a padded envelope, along with a small note. If you feel lost, let this guide you home. She addressed it to Faith and sent it through a discreet courier, anonymous, untraceable. Her hands trembled, but she didn't hesitate. It's time, she whispered. Faith was in her room when the package arrived. She opened it slowly, confused, then saw the old recorder. Pressing play, she listened. The static crackled before two voices filled the air, Angela's and Dr. Kelvin's. Faith's blood ran cold. She played it again. And again. Each word tore through her illusions like glass shards. Cleaner's child, stolen life. The truth rang like a scream she had buried deep within. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she curled on the floor, clutching the recorder like a lifeline. She didn't eat that day, or the next. Angela knocked on her door several times, but Faith remained locked inside. When the third day came, she packed a small bag, slid on plain flats, and walked out without a word. Her driver offered to call Angela. She refused. No one needs to know where I'm going, she said softly. I just need to find something real before I forget who I am. And with that, she headed to the only place that had ever felt safe. When Abigail opened her door and saw Faith standing there, drenched in light rain and shivering slightly, her breath caught. The sight was almost too much to process. Faith didn't speak right away. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from days of crying. She stepped inside slowly, looked around the modest room with trembling lips, and whispered, "Tell me it's true. I need to hear it from you." Abigail's knees gave out as she lowered herself to the edge of her bed. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she said, tears already streaming. "But yes, I'm the one who brought you into this world. They took you from me before I even held you. But I never left. I cleaned your messes. I watched you grow. I was here. Always here." Faith fell to her knees and clutched Abigail like a child begging time to reverse. For a moment, neither could speak through the sobs. Their hearts beat wildly against one another, a desperate rhythm born from years of distance and aching. "I kept hearing your voice in my dreams," Faith cried. "I never knew who it was, but now I do." Abigail brushed a wet strand of hair from her daughter's cheek. "They tried to raise you with gold and pride," she said softly, "but love. Love was left on the floor with me." Faith clung tighter. "I'm so sorry it took me this long. I should have known you were mine. I felt it every time you looked at me." Abigail kissed the top of her head, hands cradling her like the infant she was never allowed to hold. "You came home, Faith. That's all I've ever prayed for." And there, in that tiny servant's room with cracked paint and paper-thin curtains, the bond that had once been stolen was sealed, not with blood or confession, but with a single embrace that made the years melt away. The next morning, Faith made a decision. No more secrets, no more pretending. She drafted a post for her social media, a place filled with filtered photos and fabricated smiles, and wrote, "I was never hers. I belong to the woman who scrubbed your floors." Then she attached the birthmark photo and pressed post. Within hours, the internet erupted. Hashtags swirled. Reporters camped outside the Wellington estate. The headline dominated every news outlet. "Millionaire's daughter reveals shocking family secret. Cleaner's child stolen at birth?" Angela watched the news from her bedroom, frozen in disbelief, her face drained of color. "She posted it," she whispered, clutching her robe. "She exposed everything." Thomas stood at the window, silent, unmoving. "Did you think the truth would stay buried forever?" he asked coldly. Angela didn't reply. She knew the avalanche had already begun. Meanwhile, Abigail stood quietly at the edge of a crowded street, watching strangers scroll through their phones with wide eyes. A man beside her whispered, "Did you see this? What kind of woman steals another's baby?" She looked away, heart pounding. Across town, Faith ignored the calls from journalists, influencers, and even Chris. She turned off her phone and sat with Abigail in silence, leaning her head on her shoulder. "It feels like the world is burning," Faith murmured. Abigail responded gently. "Sometimes the world needs to burn before something honest can grow." At the Wellington mansion, security turned reporters away as Thomas retreated into his office, and Angela collapsed into a chair, weeping into trembling hands. But the truth was no longer theirs to control. The child who had once been traded in silence now stood before the world with a voice that shattered glass, strong, defiant, and no longer willing to be anyone else's story but her own. The mansion felt colder than usual as Thomas stormed into the drawing room, the headlines from the morning's papers clutched in his fist. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the marble-floored silence. Angela looked up from her glass of untouched wine, her face pale and drawn. "Thomas, please," she began, but he slammed the newspaper down in front of her. "Cleaner's baby stolen by Millionaire's wife," screamed from the page. "You told me she was ours. You made me bury that child and hold another like nothing happened." Angela's hands trembled. "I was desperate," she whispered. "You were already distant. I didn't want to lose everything." Thomas paced the room, fists clenched. "So you stole a woman's child to secure your position? To keep me from leaving?" He turned to her, disgust in his eyes. "You turned this house into a graveyard of secrets." Angela's voice cracked. "I raised her, Thomas. I loved her." But Thomas shook his head. "You possessed her. You shaped her like one of your dinner parties, polished and planned. You never gave her love. You gave her a performance." The weight of his words hit Angela like a wave. "I didn't think she would find out. Not like this," she sobbed. Thomas's voice lowered, heavy with disappointment. "The worst part is, you made me believe that silence was loyalty. That looking away was love." He walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "I don't know what I was trying to protect anymore," he muttered. "But I know now who truly lost the most, Abigail, and Faith." He left without another word, and Angela collapsed into the couch, the silence finally turning on her. The engagement dinner, once set to be a spectacle of wealth and alliances, had transformed into a silent battlefield. Chris stood awkwardly near the head table as murmurs filled the room. The press had been disinvited, but rumors still circulated. Faith arrived alone, wearing a simple navy dress, not designer, not tailored, just honest. When she stepped onto the platform where the engagement toast was meant to begin, all eyes followed her. Chris moved to take her hand, but she stepped away gently. "Thank you for being here," she said calmly. "But there won't be an engagement tonight." A hush spread, Angela gasped. Thomas closed his eyes. Faith took a breath and continued. "I've spent my entire life living by someone else's plan. Tonight, I take it back." Chris tried to save face. "Faith, let's talk privately." She shook her head. "There's nothing left to discuss. You were part of their arrangement, not mine." They stepped back, humiliated. Faith turned to the crowd. "I don't belong to a family built on deception. I belong to the woman who lost everything and still managed to raise me from the shadows. I owe her this much." Angela rose, panic in her voice. "Faith, don't do this." "You're embarrassing yourself." Faith turned sharply. "No, Mother, I'm saving myself." With that, she descended the platform and walked straight to the exit. Outside, Abigail waited by a taxi holding a shawl. Faith wrapped herself in it and whispered, "I've never felt more seen." They drove off into the night, while behind them, applause broke out among a few brave guests who recognized courage when they saw it. It was a grand event, an annual charity gala hosted by the Wellingtons, ironically in support of mothers and children in crisis. This time, though, the air was different. Faith had returned, but not with Angela. She arrived arm in arm with Abigail, dressed modestly yet radiantly in soft peach. Photographers scrambled, whispering, "Is that the cleaner?" Abigail, uncomfortable in the spotlight, tried to pull away, but Faith held firm. "You belong right here," she said quietly. Inside the ballroom, eyes widened as Faith bypassed the family table and led Abigail straight to the head table, where she pulled out the chair beside her. "Tonight, my mother sits with me," she announced. Gasps rippled across the hall. Angela, already seated nearby, turned pale but said nothing. Her throne was gone, and she knew it. Faith's speech brought the room to a hush. "I was raised in lies but rescued by love," she said into the microphone. The woman beside me didn't birth me into wealth, but into truth, and I honor her tonight." Abigail blinked back tears, her hands trembling under the table. "She scrubbed the marble under your shoes, but her strength is what lifted me to stand here." The crowd, initially tense, erupted into applause. Even Thomas stood up and clapped slowly, nodding at Abigail with rare respect. Angela lowered her gaze, her place beside Faith visibly taken. And for the first time, Abigail sat not behind the curtain, not at the service entrance, but at the center of the room where she belonged. Her eyes met Faith's, and in them was a message only they could read. "We've come full circle. Together." The courtroom was quiet, save for the sound of clicking pens and rustling papers. Abigail sat on the witness stand, her back straight and voice steady, even as her heart thundered beneath her blouse. The lawsuit she had filed was not for compensation but for acknowledgement, for the truth to be recognized legally. She had sued the hospital for negligence and falsifying birth records, and though Dr. Kelvin had died years earlier, his recorded voice now echoed in the courtroom through the audio Abigail had preserved all these years. As the judge replayed the confession for everyone to hear, gasps filled the gallery. "She'll never know. The cleaner's child is better off with me," the tape revealed. Abigail sat motionless as the world finally heard what she had lived with in silence. The defense tried to deflect, claiming she had no solid proof of intention, but Faith rose from the public bench and asked to speak. The judge allowed it. Standing in front of the room, Faith spoke with calm clarity. "My name was stolen, my beginnings rewritten, but the woman sitting here never left me. She worked 2 jobs under the same roof that had my face in every frame, but not once gave her a place at the table. This is not about vengeance. This is about dignity. Mine, hers." The judge leaned forward, visibly moved. By the end of the session, a ruling was passed. Abigail's child had indeed been unlawfully taken, her name restored as the legal mother, and the hospital was found guilty of misconduct. Abigail didn't cry as the verdict was read. She closed her eyes, breathed in deeply, and whispered, "Finally." It wasn't justice as the world defines it. It was peace. Faith walked through the Wellington mansion with a cardboard box in her arms, not filled with valuables, but with the few things that felt like her own. A locket Abigail once gave her, a sketch pad from childhood, and the journal where she had written poems she never shared. She moved with quiet determination, ignoring the stares of staff members who once bowed to her. Angela watched from the second-floor landing, unable to summon the strength to descend. "You're really going," she called out, her voice thin. Faith didn't look up. "Yes, I've stayed in a house that was never mine long enough." Angela gripped the railing. "You're still my daughter, whether you like it or not." Faith finally looked at her, eyes resolute. "No, I was your cover-up, and now I choose truth." Later that night, Abigail opened her door to find Faith standing there, suitcase in one hand, the other holding a brown paper bag. "I didn't know what you had in the kitchen, so I brought us bread and groundnut," she said with a tired smile. Abigail stepped aside, her throat tight. "There's not much space," she warned gently. "There's enough," Faith replied, setting the suitcase down beside the worn sofa. The room was small, humble, but warm with presence. That evening, they sat on the floor and ate from the same plate, laughing between bites. "Do you snore?" Faith asked playfully. "Only when my heart is full," Abigail teased. As they lay on separate mattresses, the silence was no longer heavy. It was healing. For the first time in her life, Faith fell asleep without a weight on her chest and woke up knowing she belonged. Angela roamed the now too large house like a restless shadow. The chandeliers sparkled, the flowers were freshly changed, and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon, but none of it touched her. She wandered into Faith's old room and ran her fingers across the bookshelf, then picked up a pair of ballet shoes from under the bed. Holding them to her chest, she collapsed onto the floor, a wailing sound escaping her throat, one that hadn't been heard in 20 years. For the first time, her tears weren't performative. They were raw, shaking, and uncontrollable. "I loved her," she cried into the silence. "She was mine too, wasn't she?" But the walls didn't answer. Neither did the portraits or the perfume she sprayed to pretend she was still composed. Thomas entered the room quietly, his expression unreadable. The housekeeper said you haven't eaten in 2 days, he said softly. Angela didn't turn. Do you think she'll forgive me? She asked. Thomas sighed and sat beside her. Forgiveness comes after truth. You gave her none. She looked at him, mascara smudged, voice hoarse. But I raised her. I taught her everything she knows. Thomas shook his head slowly. You taught her how to survive you, not love you. Angela wept harder, curling into herself. I thought if I held her tight enough, she wouldn't see the cracks. He placed a hand on her shoulder, heavy and distant. But she didn't belong to your illusion, Angela. She belonged to herself. And now, she's found someone who lets her be just that. He stood and left the room, leaving Angela surrounded by things that once sparkled, but now simply echoed. Abigail sat outside on a wooden stool, peeling yam under the early evening sky. Her birthdays had passed quietly for decades, unacknowledged, unspoken, and honestly forgotten by most. But this year was different. She heard laughter and movement from inside her small apartment. Faith, what are you doing with my pot? She called out. Nothing, came the reply, followed by a clatter. Moments later, Faith stepped out holding a small cake from a neighborhood bakery, 3 plastic spoons tucked under her arm. Happy birthday, Mama, she said softly, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. Abigail froze, her eyes welling with tears instantly. What did you just call me? She whispered. Faith smiled and whispered again, Mama. For the first time, the word didn't echo in sorrow, it echoed in belonging. They sat on the mat and ate the cake together with spoons and laughter, talking about everything and nothing. Faith lit a single candle and said, Make a wish. Abigail closed her eyes and whispered something so quietly. Faith couldn't hear. What did you wish for? Faith asked. Abigail smiled, eyes moist. I didn't need to wish. My prayer already came true. You're here. Later that night, Faith presented her with a hand-drawn card, a picture of a little girl holding hands with a woman in an apron. Underneath it, Faith had written, Thank you for staying, even when I didn't know you were mine. Abigail pressed it to her chest and wept softly. All those years, she whispered, I would have waited 1,000 more. That night, they didn't sleep early. They stayed up sharing memories, one from presence, the other from absence, until they met in the middle of healing. The knock came just before dusk. Abigail opened the door cautiously and was startled to see Thomas standing there, dressed down in jeans and a blazer, holding a small potted hibiscus plant. I didn't know what to bring, he said awkwardly. Flowers seemed too little. But Faith said you liked hibiscus. Abigail stood in silence, uncertain. May I come in? He asked. She hesitated, then stepped aside. The room smelled of pepper soup, a pot simmering gently on the stove. Thomas sat stiffly on the wooden chair, the same one that had supported Abigail through years of grief. I owe you more than words, he began. But today I only have those. Abigail nodded once, arms folded. Speak them then. Say the ones you've never said. I never asked questions, he admitted. I trusted what I wanted to believe. And when Angela told me our child was alive, I saw it as mercy, not manipulation. I let you suffer under my roof, made you answer to a name you never deserved, servant. His voice cracked. And all that time you were her mother. I let the real one sleep in darkness while I celebrated a lie. Abigail's hands trembled, but she held back the storm in her chest. You were silent, Thomas, and silence is a language too. It says, I choose not to see. He nodded, visibly ashamed. I see now. I see everything. He placed the hibiscus on her windowsill and stood. I don't expect forgiveness, Abigail. But I wanted you to know. I finally recognized the woman who raised my daughter when we failed her. She watched him leave without another word, the red petals catching the last glow of the sun. Angela sat at her grand piano for the first time in years, her fingers trembling over ivory keys that no longer sounded like music. The house was quieter now, almost too loud in its emptiness. She had written dozens of drafts, but none felt right. Then, with tear-streaked cheeks and trembling hands, she settled on honesty. She began the letter. Faith, I stole you, but I never stopped loving you. She poured out her guilt, the fear of being abandoned, the death she couldn't accept, and the emptiness she tried to fill with someone else's child. I lied because I didn't want to lose him. But in doing so, I lost myself. And eventually, I lost you. She placed the letter in a cream envelope and walked to the small flat where Abigail and Faith now lived. She didn't go inside. She simply placed it on the old piano outside their door, the one Faith had insisted they rescue from storage. The note read, "Read this when your heart is quiet." When Faith found it, she hesitated. "Should I?" she asked Abigail, who replied gently, "That's your decision. But sometimes forgiveness isn't for the one who hurt you. It's for the one who carries the weight." Faith sat on the piano stool and opened the letter. As she read, her hands trembled. The words didn't undo the pain, but they gave it shape, something she could finally name. She folded the letter, pressed it to her chest, and whispered, "I hear you, but I still need time." Abigail placed a hand on her shoulder, and together they sat under the dim porch light, letting grief and grace find their space. The auditorium was packed, but Faith stood alone on stage beneath a soft spotlight. The Women's Empowerment Forum had invited her to speak after her story went viral, but no one knew what she would say. As the microphone came to life with a low hum, she inhaled slowly, eyes scanning the sea of faces. "For years, I lived behind a name that wasn't mine," she began. "I wore titles that were polished but hollow. I smiled for cameras, dined with dignitaries, and slept each night feeling like a stranger in my own skin." The audience leaned in, quiet and attentive. "I wasn't raised in poverty, but I was raised in silence. And silence can be its own kind of prison." She paused, then looked toward the front row where Abigail sat, hands folded tightly in her lap. "This woman right here," Faith continued, her voice stronger now, "gave me more with her presence than wealth ever did. She saw me when I didn't know myself. And even when she had every reason to expose the truth, she chose love over revenge." The crowd erupted in soft murmurs. "Today, I speak not as a Wellington or as anyone's heiress, but as Faith, daughter of Abigail Daniels, a woman who taught me what resilience really looks like." The room rose to their feet in applause, some with tears in their eyes. Abigail wept openly, covering her mouth, overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement. After the event, as the audience filed out, a young girl approached Faith and said quietly, "You made me feel seen." Faith smiled, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. And every word was worth it. The sun cast a soft glow over the yard behind Abigail's home as she and Faith laid a cloth under the mango tree. It was a Sunday, free of obligations and noise, just the two of them, plus a few neighbors who had become like family. A pot of jollof rice steamed in the center, surrounded by grilled plantains, fried fish, and zobo in reused plastic bottles. "I can't believe you made all this," Faith laughed, her wrapper tied sloppily around her waist. Abigail chuckled. "You chopped one onion and declared war on your eyes. Don't overrate yourself." They burst into laughter, the kind that spilled into the trees and stayed floating between the branches like music. As they ate, Chris walked up quietly, hands in his pockets. "I'm not here to beg," he said. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for being part of the performance." Faith nodded. "Thank you for that," she replied kindly, "but we've moved past scripts here." Chris looked at Abigail and added, "You raised a good one." Abigail smiled but said nothing. After he left, they continued their meal, the clinking of spoons against plastic plates, the only rhythm they needed. As the breeze rustled the leaves above, Faith lay back and sighed. This feels like home." Abigail looked over and whispered, "Because it is." And in that peaceful space, between warm food and quiet joy, they realized healing doesn't always come with big gestures. Sometimes it lives in shared plates, Sunday laughter, and the absence of pretending. Angela stood by the window in her bedroom, thinner now, her face hollowed with time and consequence. The mansion was still grand, but empty in all the ways that mattered. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, a woman who had once controlled every narrative, but now had none left to write. With shaking hands, she signed the final version of her will. Everything, properties, shares, investments, was left to Faith and Abigail. No conditions, no control, just a quiet surrender of power she no longer wanted to hold. Her lawyer nodded. "Are you sure?" She gave a tired smile. "Yes, let the ones who carried the weight finally rest." That night, she wrote one final note. "Tell her. I was wrong, but I never stopped loving her." She folded it and placed it beside the photo of Faith at 3 years old, the same age when she'd first called Angela Mummy. Sometime before dawn, Her housekeeper found her sitting peacefully in the armchair by the window, her eyes closed, a faint smile on her lips. She had passed quietly in her sleep. When news reached Faith and Abigail, they sat in silence for a long time. She was broken, Faith said softly. Abigail nodded, but not beyond grace. They attended the burial in plain clothes, not as heirs or guests of honor, but as two women who had outlived the lies and found something real. As the casket was lowered, Faith stepped forward and placed a single rose on top. "Goodbye, Angela," she said, no longer needing to call her mother. She turned and walked away, hand in hand with the only woman who ever earned that name. The small court clerk's office was nothing like the grand halls Faith had grown up in. There were no chandeliers, no polished marble floors, just faded tiles, ceiling fans that creaked when they spun, and wooden chairs arranged in rows. But to Faith, it felt more sacred than any ballroom. She stood beside Abigail, holding the necessary forms in her hand. "Are you sure you want to do this?" the clerk asked, double-checking the request. "Yes," Faith replied firmly. "I want to legally change my surname to Daniels." Abigail's eyes glistened, her hand gently pressing against her chest. "It's not about abandoning where I came from," Faith added, looking at her mother. "It's about honoring the one who never left." The clerk nodded, stamping the forms with finality. "Then from this day forward," he said, "you are Faith Daniels." The name echoed with truth, reverberating through the walls of every moment she had ever doubted who she was. As they walked out into the sunlight, Faith turned to Abigail. "I thought I would feel lighter," she said quietly. "But what I feel is rooted, like I've finally grown into my own skin." Abigail squeezed her hand. "That name, it carries every tear I cried for you, every prayer I whispered into the dark. But now, it also carries your strength." They passed a vendor on the sidewalk, and Faith bought 2 sachets of pure water. She handed one to Abigail. "To new beginnings?" Abigail smiled. "To what was ours all along." They drank, laughing like old friends. That evening, Faith wrote her new name in the corner of her journal over and over, smiling at how right it felt. Not because it was different, but because it was real. She tucked the page into her mother's Bible and whispered, "This is where I belong." In the soft light of a Sunday morning, Abigail placed a new album on the table, a blank one, bound in brown leather, its pages crisp and waiting. "We never took many pictures," she said, "but it's time we start." Faith brought out a small stack of photos she'd gathered, some recent, some digital prints of old moments now redefined. One photo showed them in front of the little apartment, arms wrapped around each other. Another was a blurry candid of them laughing over burnt toast. "It's not picture perfect," Faith joked, "but it's honest." They pasted each photo in place, writing captions underneath. "First market day together, Mama's birthday, Sunday under the mango tree." Then, without warning, Abigail pulled out a hidden photo, one taken at the hospital 20 years ago. It was of a tiny baby wrapped in a cloth, a red birthmark visible under the ear. "I kept this," she said, her voice fragile, "even when I wasn't allowed to hold you." Faith stared at it for a long time before carefully sliding it into the first page of the album. "This is the beginning," she whispered. "Everything else led us here." Abigail smiled, tears gliding down her cheeks. "Let's call this album something special." Faith thought for a moment, then smiled. "Let's name it Finally Home." They closed the cover and placed it on the shelf, not to be hidden, but to be reached for whenever the past felt heavy or the future felt uncertain. And in that moment, there were no more secrets left between them, only pages yet to be filled. Here's the Bible verse, Ecclesiastes 3 verse 11, "He has made everything beautiful in its time." He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Explanation. This verse beautifully reflects Abigail's quiet patience and unwavering love across 2 decades of hidden pain. Though injustice reigned for years, in God's perfect timing, truth surfaced, wounds began to heal, and beauty emerged from ashes. Faith's rediscovery of her identity, Abigail's restoration, and even Angela's final repentance all unfolded at the appointed time, not rushed, not delayed. Moral of the story: truth may sleep, but it never dies. No lie, no matter how powerful, can bury the truth forever. Abigail's unwavering love, silent suffering, and refusal to retaliate show that dignity is not in loud vengeance, but in steadfast integrity. Faith's courage to confront her roots, walk away from privilege, and choose truth over comfort proves that healing often begins where pretending ends. Even Angela, broken and shamed, reminds us that confession is the first door to grace. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.